Well, hi there and welcome back as we continue in our journey through the book of James together. This week we're starting with James chapter 3. And James chapter 3 is really all about taming the tongue and the words that we use or don't use and the power and impact of those words that they have. I was thinking back this week to my one of my great foot in mouth moments. If you haven't seen me in real life, I'm kind of a big guy, I'm about 6'5", and my shoes, I'll show you, are size 15s. And I will tell you from personal experience, they fit. I was remembering back when I was in seminary, I worked at a mortgage company in Newberg, Oregon. And I had worked there for about a decade after I finished with seminary while I was kind of waiting to figure out what I was going to do next. I finished up there in Newberg at my branch. And while I was in Newberg, I was working on a particularly difficult loan with a particularly difficult client. It was just one of those that we were having to kind of get through. This fellow and his wife were moving from Newberg, Oregon to Montana. And they had sold their house and packed everything up and moved before their loan closed, before they could close on the house that they were going to move into. And we ran into all kinds of hiccups. She needed to have a paycheck to show that she had her, was actually employed at her job and what she was getting paid in her new job. And it was just a mess. It was just a mess. Highly difficult. The underwriter was difficult to work with. I was working on it with a colleague of mine in Montana. He was kind of working on the Montana side of things. I was working on the Oregon side of things. And we were emailing back and forth to try and figure out what we needed to do to close this loan for this family that was now homeless because they had sold their house, packed everything up, and moved to Montana with no place to live. And they were under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress. Well, to my shame, I started typing away on my emails, and started firing off an email to this guy about the underwriter and how frustrated I was, and how one of the things that I learned in lending is that mistakes happen in lending because of either incompetence or corruption. And most of the time, it's not corruption. It's just incompetence. And so I relayed these thoughts and feelings and questioned the competency of the underwriter, amongst other things, to my friend in Montana. And he did what we all have done. He hit reply all and then sent her a email question about something that he had a question on the file about. And she read the entire email thread, much to my chagrin. Well, I talked to the underwriter the next day, and she promptly let me know that she knew what had been said and did not appreciate it at all. Luckily for me and for this family, she was the bigger person and approved our loan finally, and this family went on to get their home. And I wish I could say it was happily ever after, but things didn't work out swimmingly for them. But I look back on that now, and I think so much for being the Christian in that situation, Brian. I'm sure Jesus really appreciated that one. The truth is that James 3 deals with something far too close to our hearts. It deals with the things that we say or don't say and the impact that has on people and on ourselves. Let's pick it up in chapter 3, verse 1. It says this: "Dear brothers and sisters, not many of you should become teachers in the church, for we who teach will be judged more strictly. Indeed, we all make many mistakes, for if we could control our tongues, we would be perfect and could also control ourselves in every other way. We can make a large horse go wherever we want by means of a small bit in its mouth, and a small rudder makes a huge ship turn whenever the pilot chooses to go, and even though the winds are strong. In the same way, the tongue is a small thing that makes grand speeches. But a tiny spark can set a great forest on fire. And among all the parts of the body, the tongue is a flame of fire. It is a whole world of wickedness, corrupting your entire body. It can set your whole life on fire, for it is set on fire by hell itself. People can tame all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and fish, but no one can tame the tongue. It is restless and evil, full of deadly poison. Sometimes it praises our Lord and Father, and sometimes it curses those who've been made in the image of God. And so blessing and cursing come pouring out of the same mouth. Surely, my brothers and sisters, this is not right. Does a spring of water bubble up with both fresh water and bitter water? Does a fig tree produce olives or a grapevine produce figs? No, and you can't draw fresh water from a salty spring. Okay. Good metaphors, James. Let's dive into this a little bit. He starts off by saying that not many of you should want to be teachers. Apparently, many were this was, keep in mind, the diaspora church. This was James's congregation in Jerusalem that had been spread out because of persecution. They had fled Jerusalem and had gone to all the different parts of the empire. And so this letter is to them in this diaspora, this dispersion. And apparently in this diaspora, without the central teachers there in Jerusalem, many people were stepping up and claiming to be teachers or wanting to be teachers in the church. And James cautions against this. Many were flocking to the prestige of teaching, but not all were equipped to teach. And this is very important. And I don't think this is James just being elitist, saying, well, I'm a teacher, you're not certified, therefore you have no place. What we say, and what James is going to point out here in the third chapter, is incredibly powerful. And teachers have an extraordinary role in our lives as mentors and leaders in our faith. We've all sat through meetings or classes or seminars with a gifted teacher, and we've all sat through the same classes and meetings and seminars with an ungifted teacher, and we know that the difference is significant. Our interest in the subject, our desire to learn and want more are piqued by a good teacher, but hindered by the ungifted teacher. James says that teachers will be judged more strictly because they carry a great responsibility to be true to Christ. And what happens to them has a much greater fallout on the rest of the church. You probably know somebody that's gone through this, as having been a pastor for almost a couple decades now. Yeah, something like that. I've seen my fair share of pastors that have been in leadership positions that have fallen, that have fallen away from their leadership role, that have fallen away from the faith, that have sinned and fallen away from the calling that God placed on them in a very public way. And that scandal that is associated with this and that disappointment, that rug being pulled out, has an incredible impact. And we know people, I know people that have been through that, where they were in a church where the pastor failed and failed magnificently. Not magnificently, failed terribly. And created a scandal and rocked the foundation, rocked the faith of many young believers. And I know one gentleman in particular that has never recovered from that loss of faith. Bill Donahue in his book relays a story from his time as a part-time youth pastor while attending seminary. He was visiting a farm where two of his students lived, and their father decided to teach Bill a lesson. He asked if I could help call in the sheep. I enthusiastically agreed. Sheep calling was like preaching. We stood at the pasture fence watching 25 sheep graze. Go ahead, he dared me. Call them in. What do you say, I asked. I just say, hey sheep, come on in. No sweat, I thought. A city kid with a bad back and hay fever could do this. I began in a normal speaking voice, but Tom interrupted. You're 75 yards away, downwind, and they have their backs to you. Yell. Use your diaphragm like they teach you in preaching class. So I took a deep breath and put every inch of stomach muscle into a yell that revival preachers around the world would envy. Hey sheep, come on in. The blessed creatures didn't move an inch. None even turned an ear. Tom smiled sarcastically. Do they teach you the Bible in that seminary? Have you ever read, my sheep hear my voice and I know them and they follow me? Raising his voice only slightly, he said, hey sheep, come on in. All 25 sheep turned and ambled toward us. Tom seized this teachable moment. Now don't you ever forget, he said, that you are the shepherd to my kids. A teacher's life is their lesson. James softens this up a little bit when he says, indeed, we all make many mistakes. He's not holding teachers to perfection, but he's emphasizing the fact that it takes a special calling to be a teacher, especially to be a teacher in the faith. in what James is talking about here, because of the responsibility that you take on yourself, the mantle that you take on of leadership, of being an example of someone who's following Christ, so that other people can see what it looks like. You're kind of a living example, a living nativity of what Jesus Christ and in your life looks like as a pastor or as a teacher. But this, indeed, we all make mistakes. I think this seems like a good reminder when we are judging teachers and when we're judging others as well, that we shouldn't be too hard on our teachers and on other people. They've got enough on their plate, and we struggle just to follow Christ. Then James makes what is really a remarkable claim. He claims that if we are able to tame our tongue, that we can be that whole person, that non-dissonance person that we talked about in James chapter 1. Again, when he talks about perfection, and the word there for perfection is this whole person, where there's continuity of thought and action and belief and deed. There's a consistency to it, where we're not disjointed. We're not saying one thing over here and thinking another thing over here, or doing something else over here and thinking something else over here, and stretched and pulled in two different directions because we're inconsistent, because we're dissonant, because we're broken and fractured. James says that we're a whole person when we claim the tongue. That it's the one thing that will drive and impact all others in your life. That you can tame yourself. If you tame your tongue, that you can curtail yourself of a great many sins. But how do we tame the tongue? Can we even tame the tongue? Is it even possible? Well, based on what James says, I would say yes and no. James says that no man can tame the tongue, and then he warns us all against its dangers. What are we supposed to do with that? If we're not able to control the tongue, then why ask us to do it if it's truly impossible? Is he asking us here to do the impossible? Yeah, I think so. But what we have to realize is that it's not an all or nothing deal. I look at it kind of like bowling. Bowling and taming the tongue are very similar kinds of things. My parents are really into bowling, and they're pretty good at it. They bowled in some tournaments and things like that. My uncle's pretty good at bowling, and they like it. They take it fairly seriously. It's a lot of fun for them, and they really enjoy it. But no one's in my family has ever bowled a perfect game. In fact, I would wager money that that's never going to happen in my family, despite the fact that my parents and my uncle are pretty good bowlers. They're not that good. They don't bowl perfect games. They don't bowl all those strikes in a row consistently over and over again. So because they can't bowl a perfect game, should they not go bowling at all? Should they just stay at home and watch bowling on TV and just watch the pros that maybe can bowl a perfect game? You know, what are we supposed to do in that situation? Well, I think what James is talking about here is that we're supposed to try. We're supposed to live. We're supposed to do it. We're supposed to bowl. And the times that we tame our tongue is kind of like the times we get a strike, when everything works the way it's supposed to, and everything's in harmony, and all the pins go down with one ball, and it's a beautiful thing. Right? It's a beautiful thing. But because no person can perfectly tame the tongue, just because we don't do it perfectly doesn't mean that we're not supposed to try and get good at it. We're supposed to tame the tongue because we recognize how dangerous the tongue actually is. That's just part of being human. There was once a couple who'd been married for 60 years, and throughout their life they had shared everything. They loved each other deeply, and they had not kept any secrets from one another, except for a small shoebox that the wife kept in the top shelf of her closet. When they got married, she put the box there and asked her husband never to look inside of it and never to ask questions about its contents. For 60 years, the man honored his wife's request. In fact, he forgot about the box until a day when his wife grew gravely ill, and the doctors were sure she had no way of recovering. So the man, putting his wife's affairs into order, remembered that box in the top of her closet, got it down, and brought it to her at the hospital. He had asked her if perhaps now they might be able to open it. She agreed. They opened the box, and inside were 2 crochet dolls and a roll of money that totaled $95,000. The man was astonished. The woman told her husband that the day before they were married, her grandmother told her that if she and her husband were to ever get into an argument with one another, they should work hard to reconcile. And if they were unable to reconcile, she should simply keep her mouth shut and crochet a doll. He was amazed that over 60 years of marriage, they apparently had only 2 conversations that they were unable to reconcile. Tears came to his eyes, and he grew even more deeply in love with this woman. Then he asked about the role of money. "What's with this?" he asked. His wife said, "Well, every time I crocheted a doll, I sold it to a local craft fair for $5. There's something to be said for trying to tame our tongues. This is a positional thing because we're actively training our tongue because we know what a powerful beast it is and how much damage it can cause. James says that people try and tame all kinds of animals, and they tame animals and even tame fish. I'm not sure how you tame fish. I know that the SeaWorld fish can be trained, but I don't think that's really what he had in mind here. Anyway, fish can be trained. So, and all kinds of animals and fish can be trained. And I got to thinking about the lion tamers. The ones that use the chair and the whip, and they've got their props, and this big act. And Siegfried and Roy, remember Siegfried and Roy and their great lion and tiger acts that they did with those big cats? 99 times out of 100, everything goes just according to plan, and everything goes on. But then there's that one accident, and the damage is done. That's what it's like with our tongues. We can go on, and everything can be fine and dandy. We can go about our business, and then all of a sudden, just that one time, we'll say something, and it'll devastate the person that we're talking to. And sometimes we don't even recognize it or realize we're doing it until after the fact. Personally, I think you have to be a little loco to train these big, dangerous animals, but people do it, and they have varying degrees of success with it, just like we have varying degrees of success taming our tongues. And I think that is what James is pointing towards. You won't get it perfect, but that doesn't mean to stop trying. That's how dangerous the tongue can be. It can get us into a mess right quick. We need to be vigilant. Yes, I said right quick. It's in my notes. I said right quick. James goes on to compare the tongue to a bit or a rudder or a spark. He's basically making the case that the tongue is a very, very small thing, and yet it wields incredible power over ourselves. Now, this is before the age of positive self-affirmation and positive self-talk and negative talk and all that kind of stuff, and the psychology behind it and all of that. But I think James hits on something here, that the words we use and how we use words have a dramatic impact even on ourselves. How we talk about ourselves, how we talk to ourselves has a huge impact on how we view ourselves and how we get by. So how do we go about training the tongue? We can get into all the psychological stuff later. How do we go about training it? What do we do? Well, 3 things. One is we learn to be genuinely, humbly honest. If you want to tame your tongue, you have to be genuinely and humbly honest. The second thing is we need to speak the truth in love. And lastly, we need to learn to zip it. Sometimes we need to learn the best thing to say is nothing at all. We need to put our listening ears on and try that for a change. All right, let's look at these a little bit. We learn to tame the tongue by being humbly honest. And I say humbly honest because sometimes we just say, be honest, and we feel like that gives us license to just wield the truth like a 9-pound sledgehammer, right? And we just go around whacking people with the truth all the time. And I don't see Jesus in that, ever. Jesus came full of truth, John says, and love. Full of grace and truth. Truth was always balanced by grace and love in Jesus, and I think that needs to be the same with us. This is based on the idea of what Matthew says in the Sermon on the Mount, where he talks about the idea of letting your yes be yes and your no be no, that there's no need to add anything else to make it look better or worse, just speak the truth. Imagine if we got the news without the 24/7 narrative, without the commentary that we're supposed to all be following along with, and the narrative that we're supposed to all buy into. If it was just the facts and not the spin, wouldn't that be amazing? That we could just be left to decide what to do with the facts ourselves and not be told what to do by our news media, well, that's a whole different subject. But words have power, and we know that that's true. But that's what we're talking about here. Being honest when the pressure's on to conform and lie. How we are honest, though, makes a big difference. Ed Waltz says the tone of our truth-telling can build a wall or a bridge. Ed and his wife Barb are from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and they should know. They witnessed 2 types of truth-telling by 2 doctors. The Waltz's daughter Deb has cerebral palsy. Barb had hoped that Deb would walk one day. After performing a battery of tests, the first doctor led Ed and Barb into a small conference room where he bluntly laid out for them what they could expect. In a tone that was cold and emotionally disconnected from his patient, the doctor said, "It is extremely unlikely that your daughter will ever walk." Still in a state of shock from the devastating news, Barb asked, "But what kind of shoes should I buy for my daughter?" She was thinking about some special corrective shoes or perhaps some shoes connected to a brace. Without softening the blow, the doctor retorted, "Buy her whatever kind of shoes you want. She won't be using them to walk in." And with that, he quickly left the room where Barb burst into tears. Several months later, the family met with a second doctor. This time, the entire scene felt different. Ed said, "My wife asked this new doctor essentially the same question she'd asked the first one. She was still wondering if there was anything we could do that might enable our doctor to even take a few steps." The doctor paused for a moment thinking. Then he looked compassionately and directly into Barb's eyes and said, "You know what I would do if I were you, Mrs. Waltz? I'd buy my daughter the prettiest little pink shoes I could find with purple shoelaces." Barb knew what he meant. Ed said, "We talked about our experience on the way home. Both doctors had told us the same thing, that Deb would never walk. I was ashamed to say what we felt like doing to the first doctor, but we felt like hugging the second doctor. How we tell the truth makes a difference in how the truth is received. That's what makes gossip so deadly to relationships. We go around like we're just telling the truth as we heard it, but we're not taking into account the feelings of the person that we're gossiping about. Is this something that they would want us sharing publicly about them? We live in a world with competing truths, and everything is relative. It's not the truth, it's your truth or your version of the truth. And I'm supposed to respect that. How do we lovingly stand up for the truth in a relativistic world? We do it by living it as consistently as we can, and a loose tongue does no one any good. And lastly, sometimes to train our tongues, we need to learn to just zip it. That what we have to say can wait. When I was a young preacher, one of the hardest things to learn as a young preacher is how to take all of these thoughts that you have in your head and put them down on paper and then try and shape that and craft that into a message or a sermon that fits within your time frame, which for me was always 30 minutes or less. So I needed to try and fit it into 30 minutes or less. And frankly, that just takes a lot of practice and time to start figuring out how long it takes you to say things and to be able to gauge that kind of thing. When I was a young preacher and was just starting out, my wife was awesome. She's still awesome, but she would sit in the front row and she would just be engaged to the sermon and very drawn in by what I was saying, just the perfect example of the perfect congregant that every preacher wants, very, very tuned in. And then as I would start to go a little bit long, her eyes would start to glass over a little bit, and she'd start to tilt her head a little bit at me like this, like, okay. But I was not really all that subtle. I didn't really pick up on the subtle things. And so finally she developed a sign that when I went too long and it was time to really wrap it up, she'd just give me the little, bring it in, or wrap it up sign, very discreetly in front of her chest while I was preaching. And that told me, you're done. You've said everything that needs to be said, and if you say any more, it's going to hurt your message. And I had to learn that lesson early on as a young preacher, and hopefully I've learned that lesson as a man as well. The only point we prove when we wag our tongue is our own ignorance. Maybe not of the subject, but did we read the room? Is what we are saying upsetting to some? Is what we are trying to do, is that what we're trying to do, is stir things up? We need to tame our tongues. It's better to say nothing and risk looking foolish rather than opening our mouths and proving that we are. Amen. All right. Have a wonderful Lord's Day. I love you. God loves you. Take care.